Angles and Relations Part 2. So there are a few more definitions that we did not talk about in the Angles and Relations Part 1 that I want to discuss. The first one is complementary angles. Complementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 90 degrees. Hopefully remember that 90 degrees means that they form a right angle. When we form a right angle, they are usually represented or indicated by a little half red box. So if I had two intersecting lines, it gives me this little red half square that automatically tells you that it's a 90-degree angle. So when I'm looking in this first example from the previous video, you can see that I don't have any 90-degree angles, which is why I wrote down the second little diagram. If I have two perpendicular lines, A and B, perpendicular means that they cross and form exactly 90-degree angles. And I have this transversal, or this intersecting line of line C. So if I know that A and B, A is perpendicular to B, our symbol for perpendicular is an upside down capital T, because again, it forms that 90-degree angle. So if I know that A and B are perpendicular, that means that angle 1 has to be 90 degrees. Angle 4 would also have to be 90 degrees. However, those are single angles in themselves, so they wouldn't be complementary, because complementary has to involve two angles that equal 90 degrees. So in this case, I have angles 2 and 3 would have to equal 90 degrees. So I have angle 2 and angle 3 would equal 90 degrees. I also have angle 6 and angle 5 have to equal 90 degrees. Now the catch is they don't have to necessarily be touching. In the previous lesson, we learned that vertical angles, angles that are directly opposite each other at an intersection, also have identical measures. Therefore, if I know that angle 3 and 6 are vertical angles, that means they would have to have the same measure. So I can replace them, because angle 3 is going to equal angle 6. So when we write our pairs, you could also have angle 2 and angle 6 instead of angle 3, or angle 5 and angle 3 instead of angle 6. The same thing goes with the 2 and the 5. Angle 2 is going to equal angle 5, because these are all vertical angles, which means they have equal measures. So I could also replace the 2 with a 5 and have angle 5 and angle 3, or I can replace the 5 with angle 2 and have angle 2 and angle 6. So complementary are just two angles, any two angles that are going to add up to 90 degrees. The next definition is supplementary angles. So when we talk about supplementary angles, they are any, again, two angles whose sum is 180 degrees. If you are not aware, 180 degrees is equal to half of a full circle. So if you can draw a half circle between two angles, we know that that is automatically going to be supplementary angles, but again, they don't have to be touching each other. So up here in the diagram that we used from the previous lesson, I can draw a half circle over 1 and 2. So I know that 1 and 2 would be supplementary angles. I could also draw a half circle between 3 and 4. So those would be supplementary angles. I also can draw them between 2 and 4 and between 1 and 3. So at this intersection alone, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 sets of supplementary angles. If I look down at line B and my transversal of x, again you would have 4 sets. I would have 5 and 6, I would have 7 and 8, I could have 6 and 8, and I could have 5 and 8. However, that's not all of them, because for supplementary, it doesn't say that they have to be touching each other. It just says 2 angles. So if we use our vocab terms from the previous lesson, if I know that angle 2 is the same measure as, say, angle 6, because angle 2 and angle 6 are corresponding, that would mean that they have to have the exact same measures. So I could say that angle 1 and angle 6 are supplementary, because if these two have the same, I can replace the 2 with the value of 6, and it's going to give me that same value. So angle 1 and 6, or angle 5 and 2. So again, you have several supplementary angles just within these 8 angles that they give you. You just need to make sure that you're looking back at your vocabulary terms from that previous lesson. The difference between our supplementary angles and our linear or straight angles, in this case they have to be 2 adjacent angles. So they have to be touching in order to be linear or straight angles, and that's because they would have to form a straight line. So the only way that they can form a straight line is if you use the example like 3 and 4. They're on the same horizontal line, or on the same straight line. If I looked at 5 and 7, I could draw that half circle because they're on this same straight line. So the difference between linear and supplementary is linear has to be, the angles have to be touching each other, whereas supplementary, they don't have to. You can use any 2 from this example that add up to 180 degrees. And the last set of examples, I'm not going to write all of them, but I'm going to talk about a few in here. So, if I have exterior angles, we said exterior angles were angles outside of parallel lines. So if I have exterior angles, my exterior angles are going to be all of the angles that are outside of these 2 parallel lines, A and B. So I would have angle 1, angle 2, angle 3, all of these up here, and I would have 11, 12, 13, and 14 on the bottom. I'm just going to put 11 through 14. For my interior angles, we know that those have to lie inside of my parallel lines. So all of my interior angles are this big group right here in the center. So I have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So I'm just going to write angles 4 through angle 10. Those are all of your interior angles. When we talk about corresponding, again, remember, it has to do with the parallel lines and your transversal. So corresponding means the same place of your parallel line. So in this case, above the parallel line, and the same location in regards to your transversal. So if I'm looking at my X, if I have a 1, it's above and to the left. Let's look at 3. 3 would be above and to the right. So if I'm looking at angle 3, corresponding means that it would have to be above, again, and to the right. So that's going to be angle 8. So I have angle 3 and angle 8. Remember that corresponding also means that they have to have identical measures. So they're both small angles, so we can assume that that's correct. If I have angle 4, it's below and to the left. Below and to the left would be angle 11. Those are just 2 examples, but you have many more. So again, just remember your vocabulary terms when you're determining these. If I'm talking about complementary, we said complementary angles had to equal 90 degrees. So 2 angles that add up to 90 degrees. So 14 is not a complementary angle because it is exactly 90 degrees itself. Same thing with 9, 10, and 13. These are all already 90 degrees, so you can't add them together or add them to something else for it to equal 90. So when we look up here at this intersection, you can see that your vertical line is perpendicular to line A. 1 is already 90 degrees and so is 6. So you only have 2 options. You have angles 2 and 3 are going to equal 90 degrees, and you would have angles 4 and 5 that are going to equal 90 degrees. Down here, you don't have any that equal 90 degrees because you don't have a perpendicular line intersecting them. It's just that transversal X. And the last one is your supplementary angles. And supplementary angles, we said, were 2 that had to equal 180 degrees. You have a lot more options for these because you have multiple intersecting points. So, for example, I have 10 and 14 could be supplementary because I can draw that half circle. We said when you can draw that half circle on a straight line, that means that these are also linear, but not all linear, not all supplementaries have to be linear. So another example would be if I used 1 and 6. I can use 1 and 6 because I know that angle 1 is already 90 degrees, and so is angle 6. So when you add up 90 and 90, it's going to give you 180 degrees. And a final example that I want to talk about would be on your transversal. If I'm looking at terms on my transversal, again, you can draw your half circle on 11 and 7 because they form that linear line. It doesn't have to be a vertical line. It doesn't have to be a horizontal line either. They just have to form a straight line in order for it to be a linear, and all linears are supplementary.